There's a story written by Jen and I. It's called Bountiful Buttons. You can't hear us.
How about now? Can you hear us now?
What's going on with my mic?
Oh, it's inside your mask.
Oh my goodness.
Because you have 14 layers of things to coordinate.
Can you hear us now? Fabulous.
Yay!
Hooray!
Hello. Good morning.
So our story this morning is written by Jen and I, and it is called Bountiful Buttons.
Bountiful Buttons. So once upon a time, there was a land where buttons were very important. If you wanted to have food, you needed to have buttons. If you wanted a place to live, you needed lots and lots of buttons. If you wanted to go to the movies, or if you needed to go to the doctor, you needed lots of buttons. If you wanted to play sports or watch sports, you needed buttons. If you had a pet, you needed buttons. There really were very, very few things that you could have or do that didn't require buttons. That's how important they were.
The strange thing that was that even though everyone needed buttons, people were very uncomfortable talking about buttons. They didn't like to talk about anything about the buttons. They didn't like to talk about the fact that they didn't have enough buttons. They didn't like to talk about it if they had a lot of buttons. They didn't want to discuss anything about buttons because it made them feel kind of awkward and a little bit uncomfortable. It was strange because buttons were so much a part of so much of what they did, and yet they could barely have a conversation about it.
So strange.
Really weird.
Well, in that land, there was a church, strangely, a little bit like our church, that had been around for many, many years. And the church community worked hard to welcome everyone who wanted to be there. And they tried to live their lives responsibly and live by their values. And they talked about a lot of difficult topics. But even in that very earnest church, people would not talk about buttons.
Weird.
Even though they were so important. And the funny thing is, it required a lot of buttons to keep that church going. They had to take, isn't that wild? They had to take care of the building and continue the work that the church was trying to do. So, buttons were just as necessary for the church as they were everywhere else in the land, but people just didn't want to talk about it. But the people of the church were the ones responsible for providing the buttons. There weren't set prices for being a member of the church because the people felt like that wouldn't be a fair way to love each other because everybody had different amounts of buttons.
So, when it was time to round up the buttons to support the church, they would just put out a jar and ask people to fill the jar. And people would kind of think to themselves, how much should I put in the jar? And they'd kind of guess, and they'd feel sort of uncomfortable, and they'd put some buttons in the jar. And sometimes there would be enough buttons in the jar, and sometimes there wouldn't be enough buttons in the jar. And it still kept feeling kind of awkward and a little uncomfortable until one day, a few church members decided that they thought not talking about something so important was silly.
So these people stood up. This group of people stood up. And some were taller than others, so they had to help others be seen in the community. And this group decided that they were going to talk about buttons. So they started having meetings together, and they got to know each other really well, and they talked about buttons, and they talked about how to talk to other people about buttons. And they built a special relationship together in their little group, and they really started to enjoy each other's company. Then they took a step further, and they decided that not only would they make button talk less awkward, but they would even make it fun. So they got creative, they jumped up and down, they danced, they made fun videos, they told jokes, They even threw buttons off the balcony. And then they made themselves available to the whole community for anyone who wanted to ask questions or talk about buttons and know how to decide how many buttons to give. They gave tips, and they helped the people to feel good about knowing how much they would be contributing. And they showed the people exactly what all the buttons were used for. And they were asking people when it was time to get buttons. And if the jar was bigger, they told the people, and the people stepped up. And they worked tirelessly and thoughtfully until the jar was full.
And that is where that community is now. But there is a continuation to that story, because eventually that community started to change the way they thought about buttons. Some people pushed their own edges and started to talk about buttons or ask for help and offer their buttons without fear or secrecy. It didn't happen right away. It took a long time. But eventually that community got a lot more comfortable talking about buttons, and then that comfort started to spread out into the community around them. So in that little church, they felt more at ease, and then each of them carried that ease into conversations with their families, into conversations in other organizations where they volunteered, and slowly but surely, that little bit of change spread. And after a long time, people stopped being so strange and weird and awkward and uncomfortable talking about buttons. Can you imagine that?
So here at South Church, we don't need to have buttons are really cool, but we don't need to have buttons to make things work. So that's not the church in this story. But at South Church, talking about money has been almost as awkward as talking about buttons. And there is a group of people here who works really hard on that.